On July 28, 1914, the age of Indiana Jones came to an end. Of course, no one knew it at the time. All anyone knew was that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had declared war on the tiny kingdom of Serbia. In hindsight, however, it is clear that the chain of events that eventually led to the outbreak of the First World War also fundamentally undermined the conditions that had once made Western expeditions in non-Western lands possible. In Episode 8, we talked about the so-called Schliemann precedent, the steamrolling of principled non-Western resistance by unprincipled Western force and money. One of the more significant effects of World War I was to destroy the conditions that made the Schliemann precedent possible. But how did this come about? First, the battlefields of Europe forced every Western empire to withdraw all but essential diplomatic personnel from their overseas colonies. Every possible resource was devoted to winning the war back home. Not only that, but in an effort to gain an edge over their rivals, each empire tried to procure the material and political support of every possible colonial ally, be it in the form of labor, goods, or bases. But even when such things were simply taken rather than negotiated, they still came with strings attached. In exchange for their help, willing or unwilling, countries located outside the European theater of war demanded future concessions as payment for contributions to a war they had had no hand in bringing about. As a result, many promises were made, most often in the form of greater political autonomy and freedom from European rule after the war ended. Such promises had the effect of emboldening native politicians to take concrete measures to ensure the realization of these promises in the event the European later reneged on his pledge. And renege they did. From Egypt to China, promises tendered during the stress of war were tossed aside in capricious pursuit of new geopolitical goals that arose after the war ended. Fortunately for the rest of the world, the betrayal of the West had been anticipated and prepared for. With the Europeans distracted by war, new political parties emerged throughout the non-Western world. In Egypt, the most prominent of these was the Waft Party. In 1919, members of the Waft Party traveled to the Paris Peace Conference to protest the wartime occupation of Egypt by the British and to demand their country's independence. 2 years of protests, demonstrations, and negotiations followed. Finally, in February 1922, the British bowed to the inevitable backlash of their treatment of the Egyptians during the war and declared Egypt independent. In the realm of politics, this Egypt marked a fundamental break with the past. Unlike the sultans and pashas of the 19th century, organized political parties like the Waft, taking their cue from Western democracies, based their legitimacy entirely on the support of the Egyptian masses as expressed through the ballot box. The rule of a democratic party could not be based on consent from God or descent from one's ancestors, as the kings, dukes, sultans, and emperors of yesteryear had invariably claimed. Instead, it is based upon the conditional approval of one's fellow citizens, from the wealthiest landowner to the poorest peasant, at least in theory. This carries important implications for the trade in art and antiquities. Previously, the museums in Cairo and Constantinople were designed mostly to secure Western acknowledgement of the enlightenment and progress of its non-Western architects. Because the masses played no role in the political legitimacy of their elites, the museums built by these elites did not cater to their approval. Instead, they catered to those guests whose opinions did carry political weight, Westerners and westernized domestic elites. Now, however, the opinion of the masses really did matter, for no politician could get elected, and stay elected, without their vote. And one of the easiest ways to curry favor with the masses, both then and today, is to advertise oneself as the champion of core cultural values rooted in the distant past. In Egypt, this meant the pharaohs. Of course, as we saw briefly in Episode 7, and will treat more fully in Episode 11, most Egyptians did not identify in any meaningful way with the age of the pharaohs. But Western-educated Egyptian elites most certainly did. To them, adoration of the pharaohs constituted a progressive platform, one that defined its adherents as modern men of science, dedicated to the study and regeneration of the most glorious civilization ever to grace their land. Though the Egyptian masses might not be on board with these ideals yet, their leaders were now determined that they should be. As such, no Egyptian politician could ever again countenance the removal of historical artifacts associated with his preferred version of the Egyptian past. To do so would be interpreted as a betrayal of the Egyptian nation itself, tantamount to political suicide. Historians refer to this ideology as nationalism, in which no form of compensation, be it diplomatic, financial, or social, is sufficient to replace the perceived injury to one's core political identity as defined by the cultural treasures of the distant past. This was the political and ideological backdrop for what is perhaps the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. Our story begins and ends with Howard Carter. Carter first arrived in Egypt in the 1890s to work as an apprentice alongside more established excavators such as Flinders Petrie and Percy Newberry. Carter, the son of a painter, was employed primarily as a draughtsman, producing color reproductions by hand of ancient pharaonic temple art and hieroglyphs, an essential task in the era before color photography. In 1899, Carter was tapped by Gaston Maspero, the French director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, to assume the duties of the Chief Inspector of Upper Egypt, based at Luxor. For the next 5 years, Carter was tasked with overseeing the management of important sites. His somewhat pedestrian duties included the installation of gates and electricity, construction of donkey parks, pursuit and persecution of tomb raiders, and paying local farmers not to use nearby ruins as fertilizer for their fields. In 1904, Carter was promoted to Chief Inspector of Lower Egypt. Just 1 year later, a scandal at the Pyramid of Saqqara led to his resignation from the government. Carter had made the grave mistake of ordering his Arab staff to defend themselves after they were assaulted by drunken French tourists who had refused to pay admission fees to the site. In a sharp rebuke, Gaston Maspero, the French director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, informed Carter that the setting of, quote, natives against Europeans was not a proper thing to do. Carter, however, refused to issue an apology to the French, preferring instead to take his skills and knowledge to the open market. For the next 3 years, he made ends meet as an antiquities dealer for Europeans and Americans who wished to obtain their own pharaonic antiquities from afar. Had it not been for the fortuitous arrival of a hopeless gentleman archaeologist, Carter might have continued in that capacity for many more decades. That hopeless gentleman was the Earl of Carnarvon. Typical of the leisured classes of his day, the Earl had long traveled throughout Egypt, amassing a respectable collection of pharaonic antiquities for display at his country house back home, the now famous Highclere Castle. For no particular reason, Carnarvon one day judged himself fit to organize his own excavations in Egypt. Maspero, after issuing the Earl a permit and seeing the predictably lax and messy results of his handiwork, urged him to hire a scholar who could properly manage his digs. Carter took the job. Then, in 1914, a permit for the Valley of the Kings suddenly became available. Pierre Lecoux, Maspero's successor in the Antiquities Service, agreed to transfer the concession to Carnarvon. For 6 years, Carter organized annual excavations throughout the Valley of the Kings on behalf of Carnarvon. In the summer of 1922, with Carter's efforts having yielded little of interest, the Earl called him back to Highclere Castle and informed him of his intent to abandon the valley. Carter, as if acting out a Hollywood script, begged the Earl for one last season. He was certain, he said, that the intact tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh of the 13th century BC, was still out there. Carnarvon, impressed by Carter's tenacity, agreed to one final season. On November 1, 1922, Carter arrived back at the Valley of the Kings. Just 5 days later, he sent his celebrated telegram to the Earl. At last had made wonderful discovery in the valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations, Carter. From the outset, both Carnarvon and Carter fell into old imperialist habits. Carnarvon informed the Metropolitan and British Museums that he planned on giving them the lion's share of the tomb's contents. For his part, Carter told a friend that he had found, quote, enough stuff to fill the whole upstairs Egyptian section of the British Museum. Before long, Carter erected an iron door barring entry to the keep. To make matters worse, Carnarvon took the liberty of granting the London Times a monopoly on all press access to the tomb, a move that infuriated the nationalist Egyptian press. The sultans of old may have tolerated such shenanigans, perhaps as a means of obtaining precious diplomatic capital, but an independent Egypt, run by nationalist politicians who viewed the pharaohs as their own ancestors, would not. Within weeks of the tomb's discovery, Carter was already at loggerheads with Egyptian officials in Cairo. First, Carter was ordered to turn over lists of his guests and staff for vetting by Cairo. Then he was told to host a revolving door of domestic and international dignitaries whom the Egyptians wanted to impress. In February 1924, not long after the alleged indignity of having one of his guest lists approved by the Egyptians, Carter decided to close the tomb. The response from the chief inspector of Lower Egypt was a marked departure from the deferential treatment of old. He fervently hoped, he said, that he did not, quote, get an order to blow up the disgustingly strong door by means of which you have locked up the treasures of Egypt's ancestors. A few weeks later, that order came. The Antiquities Service unilaterally revoked Carnarvon's permit and sent Egyptian soldiers to cut the locks to the tomb. Pierre Lecow took the opportunity to remind Carter of the new balance of power in Egypt. The government no longer discusses, but conveys to you its decision, he said. Indignant, Carter responded with a lawsuit and letters of protest to newspapers around the world, all to no avail. In the end, neither Carter nor the heirs of Carnarvon got a single artifact from the tomb. For the first time ever, 100% of the proceeds from an archaeological dig went straight into the museum of the host country. For Carter, the timing of his discovery had sealed its fate. Had he discovered Tut's tomb in any of his previous 6 seasons of digging, before Egypt gained its independence from Britain, most of the artifacts would have ended up in London and New York. Today, however, anyone who wishes to see the treasures of Tutankhamun must book a trip to Cairo. At long last, the Schliemann precedent was dead. In its place was the King Tut effect, with reverberations throughout the Middle East. Please join us next time as we explore the Mummy's Curse in Episode 10 of Indiana Jones in History.